The crystal chandeliers of Il Sipario had witnessed millions of dollars illegally exchange hands, but they had never illuminated something as jarring as the bruised, bleeding face of a woman collapsing on the imported Italian marble. Lowering his scotch from the private balcony, the boss simply ordered, "Bring her to me." Lorenzo Bianchi did not believe in coincidences, and he certainly did not believe in public spectacles. At 34, he was the undisputed head of the Bianchi syndicate, a sprawling empire of logistics, port control, and high-interest financing that gripped the eastern seaboard of the United States. His base of operations was Il Sipario, an exclusive Michelin-starred fortress on Manhattan's Upper East Side. To the public, it was the toughest reservation in New York, frequented by senators, Hollywood elite, and Wall Street titans. To the underworld, it was the absolute center of power. It was a Tuesday evening in late November, the air outside biting and crisp, while inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was a warm symphony of clinking crystal, low jazz, and hushed, powerful conversations. Lorenzo sat at his usual vantage point, a semi-private mezzanine booth draped in heavy velvet that offered a commanding view of the foyer and the main dining floor. He was nursing a glass of 20-year-old Macallan, casually listening to his underboss, Dante, brief him on a shipping container delayed at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Then, the jazz seemed to falter. The sophisticated hum of the dining room snapped into a tense, suffocating silence. Lorenzo's dark eyes shifted to the foyer. Near the mahogany coat check, a man was aggressively gripping the arm of a young woman. The man was Richard Sterling, a senior vice president at the investment firm Prescott & Hayes. Richard was a friend of the restaurant, meaning he laundered a significant portion of the Bianchi family's offshore accounts. He was a useful idiot, a man in a $5,000 Tom Ford suit whose arrogance was only eclipsed by his cowardice. But it wasn't Richard that caught Lorenzo's undivided attention. It was the woman. She was dressed in a striking emerald silk gown that clung to her slender frame, but the elegance of the garment was violently offset by the state of her face. A harsh, purpling bruise bloomed across her left cheekbone. Her lip was split, a fresh ribbon of crimson trailing down her chin, staining the pristine silk at her collarbone. She was trembling, yet her posture was rigid. As Lorenzo watched, Richard leaned in, his face twisted in a vicious snarl, and backhanded her across the face. The smack echoed over the soft jazz. The woman's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the imported Carrara marble floor. A few patrons gasped. Most simply averted their eyes, staring intently into their truffled risotto. Adhering to the unspoken rule of Il Sipario, you do not see what you are not meant to see. Lorenzo felt a sudden, uncharacteristic spike of adrenaline. He was a man accustomed to violence. He had ordered hits, broken men down to their psychological studs, and commanded a brutal organization. But something about the way the woman looked up from the floor, not with the whimpering defeat of a broken victim, but with a cold, hollowed-out fury, snagged a wire deep inside his chest. Her eyes, a piercing shade of hazel, darted upward, bypassing the terrified hostesses, bypassing her abuser, and locked directly onto the shadowed mezzanine, right onto Lorenzo. It was as if she knew exactly who he was, and exactly where he sat. Richard grabbed her by the hair, hissing something venomous, pulling her back up toward the heavy oak doors. He was trying to drag her out before the restaurant's security intervened. Lorenzo set his scotch down. The glass clinked against the wood with a quiet finality. "Dante," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that left absolutely no room for negotiation. "Boss?" Dante asked, already following Lorenzo's gaze. "The man is Richard Sterling. Take him to the soundproof room in the cellar. Do whatever you need to ensure he forgets how to speak for the next 48 hours. Lorenzo paused, his eyes still locked on the woman, as she was dragged a foot closer to the door. And the woman. "Bring her to me. Upstairs. Now." Within seconds, the well-oiled machine of the Bianchi family moved. 4 men in immaculate dark suits materialized from the shadows of the dining room. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace. 2 of them flanked Richard Sterling, their massive hands clamping down on his shoulders with enough force to shatter bone. Richard's arrogant sneer dissolved instantly into pale terror. He opened his mouth to protest, but a swift, hidden strike to his solar plexus drove the air from his lungs. He was hoisted up and practically carried toward the kitchen corridors, vanishing from sight before most patrons even realized what had happened. The other two men stepped between the doorway and the woman. She was on her hands and knees, gasping for breath, the emerald silk pooling around her on the marble. Dante approached her, his massive frame towering over her. He offered a hand, his demeanor remarkably gentle for a man who had broken jaws for a living. "Ma'am," Dante said quietly. The boss would like a word. She didn't take his hand. She pushed herself up unsteadily, wincing as her ribs shifted, and wiped the blood from her chin with the back of her trembling hand. She looked at Dante, then cast one final sweeping glance around the terrified foyer before nodding once. She followed Dante toward the private, velvet-roped staircase. Lorenzo watched her ascend, the heavy doors of his sanctuary closing behind her. The restaurant below seamlessly resumed its quiet hum, the jazz band picking up the tempo. The blood on the marble was already being wiped away by a busboy with a damp cloth, but Lorenzo knew the night had just irreparably shifted on its axis. The private office of Lorenzo Bianchi was a study in intimidating luxury. Walls of dark, polished walnut were lined with rare, first-edition books. The air smelled of aged leather, expensive espresso, and the faint, smoky hint of Cuban tobacco. Behind a massive mahogany desk sat Lorenzo, perfectly still, his dark eyes tracking the woman as Dante led her into the room. "Dr. Harrison is on his way up," Dante murmured, stepping aside to let her fully into the room. "Leave us," Lorenzo commanded softly. Dante nodded and exited, the heavy door clicking shut with a profound sense of isolation. Lorenzo stood up. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a sharp, aristocratic jawline and hair the color of midnight. He commanded the room without having to raise his voice. He walked slowly around his desk, stopping a few feet from her. Up close, the damage Richard had inflicted was even more severe. Her left eye was swelling shut, the skin a mottled canvas of black, blue, and violent purple. There were defensive scratches on her bare arms, and her breathing was shallow, indicative of bruised or cracked ribs. Yet, she stood her ground, her chin tilted upward. "Sit," Lorenzo said, gesturing to a plush leather armchair near the fireplace. "I'd rather stand," she replied. Her voice was surprisingly steady, carrying a slight, raspy edge from the trauma, but laced with an undeniable resilience. "You're in shock, and you're bleeding on my Persian rug," Lorenzo pointed out, his tone analytical, but not unkind. "Sit down before you fall down." "I don't catch people." She hesitated, then limped to the chair and lowered herself into it, letting out a sharp, involuntary hiss of pain as she settled. "What is your name?" Lorenzo asked, pouring a glass of water from a crystal carafe and handing it to her. "Audrey. Audrey Sinclair." She took the glass with trembling hands, staring at the clear liquid, as if expecting it to be poisoned. "Well, Audrey Sinclair, care to explain why a mid-level Wall Street proxy decided to treat my foyer like a back-alley boxing ring?" Lorenzo leaned against the edge of his desk, crossing his arms over his tailored vest. "Richard Sterling works for me. Ergo, his messes become my messes. And you, it seems, are a very bloody mess." Audrey took a slow sip of the water. She looked up at him, the fear in her hazel eyes warring with a profound, terrifying calculation. "He wasn't just beating me because he's a monster, Mr. Bianchi. Though he is that. He was beating me because of what I found." Lorenzo's eyes narrowed fractionally. The fact that she knew his name wasn't surprising, many did. But the calm, deliberate way she delivered the sentence changed the atmosphere in the room. "This wasn't a domestic dispute." "Go on," Lorenzo urged, his voice dropping an octave. "I've been living with Richard for 8 months, Audrey began, her voice gaining strength. "He thinks I'm just a quiet girl from Connecticut who likes expensive dinners. But I'm an actuary. I see numbers in my sleep. 3 weeks ago, he left his private encrypted laptop unlocked while he was passed out drunk. I got curious. I saw the routing numbers. Lorenzo went entirely still. The syndicate's money movement was a highly guarded secret. "He's stealing from you," Audrey said bluntly. looking directly into the eyes of the most dangerous man in New York. He's been skimming 3% off the top of the offshore routing cascades before they hit your Cayman accounts. He's masking the discrepancies by inflating the supposed transaction fees. He's taken close to $4 million over the last 2 years. A heavy, dangerous silence descended upon the room. Lorenzo's expression didn't change, but the air around him grew instantly colder. If what she was saying was true, Richard Sterling was a dead man walking. But more importantly, if she knew this, she was a liability. "And why would you tell me this, Audrey?" Lorenzo asked softly. A smart woman would have packed a bag, booked a flight to Europe, and disappeared. Audrey let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Richard has my passport locked in a safe. He has men watching the apartment. When I confronted him about it tonight, hoping to use it as leverage to make him let me go, he snapped. He realized I could destroy him." She leaned forward, grimacing. "He dragged me to this restaurant tonight because he had a mandatory check-in dinner with your associates. He told me if I didn't smile and play the perfect girlfriend, he would kill me when we got home. He was going to silence me, Mr. Bianchi." Lorenzo absorbed the information. "So, you provoked him in the lobby," Lorenzo deduced, a flicker of genuine respect igniting in his chest. "You knew you couldn't escape his guards outside, but you knew the rules of Il Sipario. You knew causing a scene here would force my hand." "I knew you were upstairs," Audrey confessed, a single tear cutting through the blood on her cheek. "I saw your car out back. I knew if he hit me in front of your people, you wouldn't let the disrespect slide. I needed you to pull me away from him." A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. "Come in," Lorenzo called out. Dr. Thomas Harrison, an older man with a black medical bag, entered discreetly. He was the family's shadow physician, a man who had stitched up bullet wounds without ever asking for a police report. He took one look at Audrey and immediately moved to her side, opening his bag. "Clean her up," Lorenzo instructed the doctor. He then looked back at Audrey, his mind racing. She had played a dangerous, suicidal game of chess, using her own physical safety as a pawn to maneuver herself into the sanctuary of a mafia boss. "You're a very foolish woman, Audrey Sinclair," Lorenzo said, walking toward the heavy drapes of his window and looking out over the city lights. "You traded a rabid dog for a wolf. What makes you think I won't just bury you next to him to keep my ledgers a secret?" Audrey winced as Dr. Harrison applied a stingingly cold antiseptic to her split lip. She locked eyes with Lorenzo's reflection in the glass window. "Because," Audrey breathed out, her voice barely a whisper but echoing loudly in the quiet office before we left the apartment. "I memorized the passwords to his shadow accounts. The $4 million he stole? You can't get it back without me." Lorenzo slowly turned away from the window, staring at the battered, bruised woman sitting in his chair. She had backed the most feared man in the city into a corner, and she had done it while bleeding out on his floor. For the first time in a decade, Lorenzo Bianchi was entirely caught off guard. And beneath the cold, pragmatic rage of his stolen millions, a dark, consuming fascination began to take root. "Doctor," Lorenzo said, never taking his eyes off Audrey, "make sure she is comfortable. Put her in the master suite down the hall. Miss Sinclair isn't going anywhere." Audrey Sinclair woke to the smell of rain against glass and the dull, throbbing ache of her own heartbeat echoing in her bruised cheek. She opened her unswollen eyes slowly, taking in the alien environment. Heavy silk drapes framed floor to ceiling, bulletproof windows that overlooked the glittering, rain-slicked skyline of Manhattan. She was lying on a California king bed draped in Egyptian cotton, her ribs tightly and professionally bound. Dr. Harrison had done his work well. The sharp, agonizing pain in her chest had been reduced to a manageable, heavy pressure, courtesy of whatever high-grade painkillers he had administered. The heavy mahogany door clicked open. Lorenzo Bianchi stepped into the room, the sharp lines of his bespoke charcoal suit cutting a striking silhouette against the dim lighting. He carried a sleek silver laptop under one arm and a steaming cup of espresso in the other. He moved with the quiet, predatory grace of a man who owned everything his eyes touched. "You slept for 14 hours, Lorenzo stated, his baritone voice calm. He set the espresso on the marble nightstand beside her. "Drink. It will help clear the fog from the painkillers." Audrey pushed herself up against the plush headboard, wincing instinctively. She reached for the small cup, her hands far steadier than they had been the night before in the restaurant foyer. "Where is Richard?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Richard is currently discovering the limitations of the human nervous system in a soundproof basement beneath the meatpacking district," Lorenzo replied smoothly, pulling up a velvet armchair and sitting beside the bed. "He has confessed to skimming. He wept quite a bit. However, he swears the amount was only $500,000, and that you are an opportunistic corporate spy who fabricated the $4 million figure to extort him." Audrey let out a short, hollow laugh that hitched her breath. Richard always lacked imagination. "If I were a corporate spy, I would have reported him to the SEC and collected a whistleblower bounty. I wouldn't have let him fracture my cheekbone." Lorenzo's dark eyes studied her face, mapping the brutal purple and yellow bruising that marred her delicate features. The clinical detachment he usually maintained was slipping, replaced by a deep, unsettling intrigue. She was trapped in the bedroom of a Mafia boss, battered and isolated, yet she looked at him with the cool calculation of an auditor reviewing a spreadsheet. "Let us test your imagination, then, Miss Sinclair," Lorenzo said, opening the laptop and placing it on the bed over her lap. He angled the screen toward her. It displayed a secure, encrypted portal for Union Bank of Switzerland, UBS, in Geneva. "My lead forensic accountant, Silas, has spent the last 12 hours trying to bypass Richard's shadow drives. He hit a biometric firewall. You claim you memorized the passwords. Prove it. Give me a reason not to write you off as collateral damage." Audrey looked at the glowing screen. This was the precipice. Once she gave him the money, she lost her leverage. But withholding it meant immediate death. She had to weave herself so deeply into the fabric of his financial survival that he couldn't afford to eliminate her. "I didn't just memorize passwords, Mr. Bianchi," Audrey said, her hazel eyes flicking up to meet his intense gaze. "Richard is a coward, but he's not a computer genius. He used a third-party proxy server based in Nicosia, Cyprus, to mask the IP addresses before routing your money. If you just log in with a password from a New York IP, the Swiss bank's automated fraud protocols will lock the account for 6 months, pending an international investigation. Your accountant should have known that." Lorenzo went entirely still. She was right. The syndicate had lost millions 3 years ago due to a similar automated freeze triggered by a careless IP ping. Silas had missed it. This battered actuary had not. "Walk me through it," Lorenzo ordered, his tone shifting from interrogator to student. For the next hour, Audrey's fingers flew across the keyboard. She bypassed the UBS portal entirely, instead opening a secure command terminal. She meticulously routed their connection through a series of ghost servers, first through a Delaware LLC shell company, then bouncing to the Isle of Man, and finally, mirroring the exact digital fingerprint of Richard's Cypriot proxy. "The password is an alphanumeric hash of his mother's maiden name and his Yale fraternity PIN number," Audrey murmured, typing the sequence. "Pathetic, really." She hit enter. The screen flashed green. A ledger appeared, detailing a numbered offshore account containing exactly $1.2 million. Lorenzo pulled his phone from his breast pocket and dialed a secure line. "Silas. Check the Geneva Cascade." He paused, listening to his accountant's shocked confirmation on the other end. "Good. Transfer it back into the primary Cayman Trust. Leave no digital footprints." He hung up. "That's $1.2 million, Lorenzo said, turning back to Audrey. "You promised me 4. The rest isn't liquid," Audrey said, closing the laptop and pushing it away. "And it's not sitting in a bank account. That's what I tried to tell Richard last night before he hit me. The money is moving. I need access to his physical hard drive to track the rest of the disbursements." Lorenzo leaned back, steepling his fingers. He was looking at her not as a victim anymore, but as an asset. A highly dangerous, incredibly intelligent asset. "You are playing a very dangerous game, Audrey. You are making yourself indispensable to a man who makes a living destroying people." "I was already being destroyed," Audrey replied softly, tracing the rim of the espresso cup. "I just decided to choose my monster." 2 days passed. Audrey remained confined to the penthouse, though the parameters of her gilded cage expanded. She was given full run of the opulent two-story apartment, provided with fresh clothes ordered directly from Bergdorf Goodman, and fed by a private chef. Her bruises began to fade from a violent purple to a dull, sickly yellow. Lorenzo had Dante bring up Richard's encrypted hard drive. The heavy, metallic brick was placed on the dining room table, which had been converted into a makeshift war room. Silas, a nervous, thin man with thick-rimmed glasses, worked alongside Audrey, though it quickly became apparent that Audrey was leading the forensic hunt. Lorenzo watched them from the kitchen island, nursing a glass of bourbon. He found himself inexplicably drawn to the quiet intensity with which Audrey worked. She didn't flinch when his armed guards entered the room. She didn't ask about the outside world. She simply stared at the cascading lines of code and financial routing numbers as if they were a second language. "Boss?" Silas called out nervously on the third evening, breaking the heavy silence of the apartment. She found the rest of the money. Lorenzo set his glass down and walked over to the table. He stood close behind Audrey, close enough to smell the faint, clean scent of vanilla shampoo on her hair. He leaned over her shoulder, his proximity sending a sudden, electric jolt of tension through Audrey's spine. "Show me," Lorenzo commanded softly. Audrey pointed a trembling finger at the screen. The financial mapping she had constructed over the last 48 hours looked like a spiderweb of global corruption, but all the threads converged on one single, glowing red node. The missing $2.8 million didn't go into Richard's private accounts, Audrey explained, her voice tight with a sudden realization. He wasn't stealing it to get rich. He was funneling it into an escrow account held by a private law firm in Zurich, Kessler, and Vance. But that's a front. A front for what? Lorenzo asked, the air in the room dropping 10 degrees. I ran an actuarial risk assessment on the payment schedules, Audrey continued, her eyes wide as she looked up at Lorenzo. The payouts aren't structured like investments or bribes. They are structured like a private military contract. Retainer up front, operational expenses dispersed weekly, and a massive balloon payment held in escrow. Silas swallowed hard. Boss. She's right. The routing numbers for the beneficiary. They trace back to a shell corporation controlled by Dominic Russo. The name struck the room like a physical blow. The Russo syndicate was Lorenzo's only major rival in the 5 boroughs. They had maintained a cold, bloodless truce for 5 years. Richard wasn't just skimming, Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a lethal, terrifying whisper. He was financing my assassination, using my own money to pay Dominic Russo's hit squad. It gets worse, Audrey said, her fingers flying across the keyboard to open a secondary ledger. Her breath hitched. Mr. Bianchi. The escrow conditions. The final balloon payment of $2 million. What about it? Dante asked, stepping forward from the shadows of the hallway, his hand instinctively dropping to the custom Glock holstered at his hip. The smart contract is automated. The money was released from escrow exactly 4 hours ago. Audrey looked at Lorenzo, her hazel eyes reflecting a sheer, unadulterated panic. In private military contracting, the final payment is only released upon completion of the objective, or when the operation reaches the point of no return. Lorenzo's mind raced with brutal, mathematical precision. If the money had cleared, the hit wasn't just planned. It was already in motion. Richard was a Trojan horse, and Lorenzo had unwittingly brought the war directly to his own doorstep. Suddenly, the ambient hum of the penthouse's central air conditioning died. The soft jazz playing through the hidden speakers cut out with a sharp pop. The lights flickered violently, died, and then the emergency red backup LEDs flared to life, bathing the opulent dining room in a bloody, sinister glow. Dante! Lorenzo roared, grabbing Audrey by the arm and hauling her out of her chair just as the heavy, reinforced glass of the penthouse's floor-to-ceiling windows shattered inward. The deafening crack of suppressed sniper fire echoed through the apartment. Where Audrey had been sitting a fraction of a second earlier, the mahogany dining table splintered, a high-caliber round tearing through the wood and burying itself in the floorboards. "Get down!" Dante yelled, flipping the heavy dining table over to create a barricade. Silas screamed, dropping to the floor and crawling toward the kitchen island. Lorenzo dragged Audrey behind a solid marble pillar near the foyer. His chest was heaving, his dark eyes scanning the shattered windows. Across the street, hidden in the dark scaffolding of an under-construction skyscraper, muzzle flashes winked like deadly fireflies. "They hacked the building's mainframe," Dante reported grimly. Pulling his weapon and firing a blind suppression burst toward the windows. "Elevators are dead. Security doors are locked down from the outside. We're in a box. Boss." Audrey was pressed tightly against Lorenzo's chest, her hands gripping the lapels of his suit. She was trembling violently. The trauma of Richard's beating colliding with the absolute terror of a live firefight. Lorenzo looked down at her. In the chaotic, flashing red emergency lights, the mask of the cold, untouchable Mafia boss fractured. He saw the sheer terror in her eyes, but he also remembered the brilliant, defiant woman who had manipulated her way into his sanctuary to survive. She had uncovered the plot. She had given him the 4 hours of warning he needed to realize what was happening. She had saved his life. "Look at me, Audrey," Lorenzo commanded, his hands coming up to grip her face gently, shielding her from the flying debris. "Look at me." She forced her eyes up to meet his. "You survived Richard Sterling," Lorenzo said, his voice a steady, grounding anchor amidst the chaos of shattering glass and gunfire. "You are not going to die in this room. Do you understand me?" Audrey swallowed hard, nodding once. "The servers," she stammered, pointing a shaky finger toward the kitchen where Silas was cowering. "If they hacked the building, they used the internal localized network. If I can get to the central control panel in the utility closet, I can trigger a manual override. I can drop the firewall and send an SOS out to your street soldiers." It was a suicide run. The utility closet was 20 feet away, straight across an open hallway exposed to the sniper fire. "No," Lorenzo said instantly, his grip on her tightening. "You stay behind me. Lorenzo, if we stay here, they will breach the stairwell and execute us." Audrey yelled, her actuarial mind snapping into survival mode, calculating the brutal odds of their situation. "It's the only variable we can control." Before Lorenzo could stop her, the heavy steel door of the penthouse stairwell groaned. Explosive breaching charges detonated, blowing the door off its hinges and filling the foyer with thick, acrid gray smoke. The Russo Syndicate hit squad had arrived. The gilded cage had officially become a war zone. The smoke was thick, smelling violently of cordite and pulverized drywall. 4 figures in tactical gear flooded through the ruined doorway, moving with practiced, lethal efficiency. Dante was already in motion, his weapon barking twice, dropping the lead mercenary with ruthless precision. Lorenzo shoved Audrey flat against the imported hardwood floor behind a thick marble pillar. He drew his own weapon, a custom matte black Heckler & Koch, from his shoulder holster, his eyes tracking the shadows in the smoke. "Stay down," Lorenzo roared over the deafening exchange of gunfire. But Audrey's mind was not frozen in panic. It was aggressively processing variables. The mercenaries were advancing in a tight tactical stack, laying down heavy suppressing fire on Dante's position. Silas was utterly useless, curled into a trembling ball behind the kitchen island. Lorenzo was pinned, exchanging calculated shots with 2 men, using the ruined mahogany doors for cover. The sniper fire from across the street had paused. They couldn't risk hitting their own men through the chaotic smoke. It was a 3-second gap in the firing pattern. That was her window. Audrey didn't wait for permission. She scrambled from behind the pillar, keeping her body low, and launched herself across the debris-strewn floor toward the utility closet. "Audrey! No!" Lorenzo shouted, his voice cracking with a raw, visceral fear he hadn't experienced in over a decade. She ignored him. Her bare feet slipped on shattered crystal, slicing her heels, but the adrenaline masked the pain. She reached the heavy steel door of the closet, yanking it open. Inside, the building's localized server rack blinked with a steady, oppressive red light. She dropped to her knees, ripping open the maintenance panel. "Flank right!" One of the mercenaries barked, spotting her movement through the haze. He swung his assault rifle toward the narrow closet. Lorenzo didn't hesitate. He abandoned the safety of his marble cover, lunging across the open foyer to intercept the line of fire. He fired 3 times, catching the mercenary in the chest and throat. But as the man fell, his finger clamped down convulsively on the trigger. A stray 3-round burst tore through the air. Lorenzo grunted, his body twisting violently as a bullet tore through his left shoulder, spinning him hard into the wall. "Lorenzo!" Audrey screamed, her hands freezing over the exposed circuitry. "Finish it!" he snarled, sliding down the wall but keeping his weapon raised, firing single, methodical shots at the remaining breachers to keep them back. Tears blurring her vision, Audrey forced her hands to stop shaking. The digital hack was too sophisticated to break from a localized terminal, so she bypassed the software entirely. She found the primary physical relay switch, the analog override. She grabbed a heavy steel wrench from the maintenance shelf and brought it down violently on the locking mechanism. The plastic casing shattered. She flipped the heavy breaker, then slammed her hand onto the emergency manual reset button. Instantly, the oppressive red emergency lights flickered and died. The penthouse was plunged into total darkness for 3 agonizing seconds before the standard power grid roared back to life. The heavy mechanical clanking of the building's reinforced security shutters echoed through the walls as the lockdown lifted. More importantly, Lorenzo's internal communications network re-engaged. Dante's earpiece crackled to life with a deafening burst of static. "Boss, penthouse is dark. We are breaching the stairwells now." The voice belonged to Vincent, Lorenzo's most brutal street captain. "Execute all hostiles." Dante barked into his lapel mic, reloading his weapon. No prisoners. The tide turned in seconds. The remaining Russo mercenaries, realizing their digital cage had just been blown wide open and an army of Bianchi enforcers was swarming up the stairs, broke formation. It was too late. Heavy automatic fire erupted from the hallway outside as Vincent's men flooded the floor. Within minutes, the chaotic roar of the firefight dwindled to a few sporadic gunshots, and then a heavy, blood-soaked silence. The acrid smoke began to clear, pulled out by the hum of the resetting ventilation system. Audrey crawled out of the closet, her emerald silk dress ruined, her knees and feet bleeding. She didn't look at the bodies scattered across the foyer. Her hazel eyes were locked entirely on Lorenzo. He was slumped against the wall, clutching his left shoulder, blood seeping darkly through the fingers of his ruined suit. Dante was already kneeling beside him, barking orders into his radio for Dr. Harrison to be brought up immediately. Audrey collapsed beside Lorenzo, her trembling hands hovering over his wound, afraid to touch it. "You stepped out of cover," she whispered, her voice fractured and breathless. "You took a bullet for an actuary." Lorenzo looked up at her, his face pale but his dark eyes burning with an intense, unyielding fire. The cold, calculated Mafia boss had vanished, leaving behind a man who had just realized exactly what he possessed. He reached out with his good hand, his blood-stained fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear, smearing crimson against her cheek. "You are not just an actuary, Audrey," Lorenzo murmured, his breathing shallow but his voice steady. "You are the woman who just saved my empire, and my life." She leaned into his touch, the terror of the night finally breaking, replaced by a profound, undeniable bond, forged in blood and survival. She had walked into Il Sipario a battered victim seeking a shield. She had emerged as the most dangerous piece on Lorenzo Bianchi's chessboard. "Dominic Russo," Audrey said softly, her hazel eyes hardening with a cold, terrifying resolve that matched his own. "He tried to kill you." Lorenzo's lips curved into a faint, predatory smile. "Yes, he did. I still have the routing cascades to his shadow accounts from my trace," she stated, the gears in her mind already shifting from survival to vengeance. "I can drain his entire organization's liquidity by morning. I can leave him with absolutely nothing." Dante paused his triage, looking up at the bruised woman on the floor with newfound, absolute reverence. Lorenzo's smile widened, despite the burning pain tearing through his shoulder. He pulled her slightly closer, the scent of gunpowder and vanilla wrapping around them in the ruins of his fortress. "Bring him to his knees, Audrey," Lorenzo commanded softly. "And then, we will take the rest." Audrey Sinclair had entered the criminal underworld as collateral damage, but she remained as its new architect. The bruising on her face healed, replaced by the unbreakable armor of a woman who had outsmarted predators. Beside Lorenzo Bianchi, she didn't just find a sanctuary. She found an empire. Together, they rewrote the rules of the syndicate, proving that the most lethal weapon in a war of monsters is a brilliant mind.